Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the AR4 Mk3 Robotic Arm kit build. In this video, we'll be going through the physical installation of the stepper motor drivers into the J1 base enclosure. We'll also be mounting the J1 base plate and J1 motor and spindle, etc. But we'll be doing the physical installation and not all of the associated wiring. This is loosely based off of pages 50 to 75 of the build manual, but we're skipping some of the soldering just to improve the order of operations, and we'll get onto that in a future episode. So follow along, we're going to get building. To begin the process of building the AR4 robotic arm kit, we start with the Joint 1 base enclosure. This is typically 3D printed, in this case out of PETG carbon fiber, and so we're using a 2mm drill bit to just clear out any remaining support material from all of the mounting holes. After clearing out the mounting holes on the bottom and for the fan enclosure on the back, we now switch to a 3.5mm drill bit in order to drill out the hinge points of the Joint 1 base enclosure tray. Once we've cleared out all of the holes in the J1 base enclosure, we need to locate the number 6 type thread screws from the AR4's mechanical kit, which are in this small Ziploc bag. And we're going to install these at the very front side of this enclosure. So now we've got them in, it should look like that with all 6 of the screws threaded into the front 6 holes. We now take our box, and from the left hand side we're going to get the 332, the DM332T stepper drivers, which are the ones with the light blue stripe. And put these with the green terminal blocks facing to the side underneath the thread on that side, so that there's the thread at the back. So taking this, and see, we'll sit like that, and we'll place it into the box. Here I am installing the first stepper driver module. The use of a magnetic screwdriver would greatly assist in installing each module, as the screw is more likely to hold onto the head of the screwdriver and not get lost. And the green and red lights of the stepper driver should face the front of the box. So working our way from left to right, we're going to do the same process for the next 2 DM322T stepper driver. Tighten them up, and they sit quite nice and tight together. perfectly spaced, the screws don't protrude out from the bottom, sitting nice and flat. If they do, then you'll want to back them off just a little bit to make sure that the base sits flat on the surface that you're on. So running your fingers over the top and making sure that they're not protruding out the bottom. We're now on to the DM320T stepper drivers, which we now go from on the right hand side of the enclosure, and that's facing from the back here where the fan enclosure would be. Again, making sure that our lights sit at the front of the enclosure, so that will give you the orientation of the terminal blocks. One final check to make sure that they're not protruding out the base, which is fine, feels nice and smooth. And that's all of the stepper motor drivers installed into the J1 base enclosure. Okay, among all of the components that have come from the kit, there should be a bag that contains some Cat6 cable, along with a small fan and a rocker motor and a 3.5mm jack. 5.5mm jack. So we're going to take all of this out of this kit here and also get our 3D printed base fan enclosure. With this, we will put our 5.5mm power jack through the wall of it. Which will screw in place like so. It's actually screwing into the 3D printed fan enclosure, and you might need to use some pliers just to tighten it up. To make it easy for our soldering, we're going to put the long lug at the bottom and the shorter lug at the top. And we're also going to fit the rocker switch in place, making sure that the off is positioned on the side closest to the rocker, closest to the power jack. Sliding that through, and it should clip into place, just like so. So that's the fan enclosure there. With and coming with this kit here is a length of 20 American wire gauge conductor wire, both black and white. And we're meant to cut a 13cm length of this, but we're going to leave this for a future video when we get to doing all of the wiring up. So for now, we're going to press fit the fan in place here, which just holds in place. And we'll leave all of this for a future video where we're going to wire it to the back of the J1 base enclosure. So we're going to skip through from page 55 through to page 62, the manual. And we're going to bring our base back here, so the second part of our base. Fitting the two pieces together, these tongues kind of fit into the slot, and it is possible to close that gap entirely off. However, bringing our J1 base plate over, we want to make sure that all of these holes line up as well. So lining it up like this, it does appear that all of the holes are lined up. And hold it up to a light source and look through each of those holes to make sure it's all nicely lined up. So in doing so, you can see that those tongues there don't perfectly go to the back of the groove. And that's why we don't glue it together until we've actually mounted these two screws here. So in the manual, or the general build instructions, it does say that you can put them together, but I've held off until this has been done to make sure that the spacing is correct. So we're going to not tap these holes either. In the build manual it says to use an M4 tap to thread the holes, but we're just going to use the screws themselves to thread the holes. And to do this, we need to find the M4 by 20 machine or pan head machine screws. So we've found the screws here. None of the screws are, although all of the screws and their quantities are specified, including washers and nuts, are specified in the bill of materials. None of these little packets of screws are actually labeled when they come in the kit. Basically means that you need a ruler and a thread tester to check the length and diameter of the different screws to make sure that you've got the right one. Now, the manual calls for the 3D printed part to be threaded with an M4 tap, and for this, and basically that it should just fall through this plate. Unfortunately, even though I've double checked that these two M4 by 20 pan head screws are the correct ones, the machine tolerances in this aluminium plate don't seem to allow for it to go through. To fix this, we'll use a 4mm drill bit and just drill out the plate. So having access to some standard tools, definitely useful in this process. And we'll also use a 3.5mm drill bit and just drill out, or a 3mm drill bit, and drill out the 3D printed part a little bit, just to make more of a pilot hole for the screws to thread themselves into. Okay, so now fitting this back over the top, we'll make sure that our holes are aligned, which I can see from looking down they are, and these should now fall through. Perfect. So with a little bit of pressure, these will thread into the PETG base, which I 3D printed 100% infill. Down here, we're not concerned about weight, more about strength. Ultimately, these are just locating screws. As I mentioned just before, we want to make sure that we don't glue the base together until these screws have gone in to locate it. And the design by Chris is quite genius, and that has this little holder there that will make sure that it's all at the right distance. And now that we have it correctly spaced, now is the time that we can use some super glue. Break the seal on that super glue, and we can put the super glue into the little gaps here. And make sure that it can come off from the table. And while it dries, we'll move the screws out the way from the shavings and just vacuum all of this up. So I've now got our base mechanically together. The next step is to fit our bearing races into the J1 turret. So to do this, it's a press fit, and unless you've got a lot of machine components at home, including a bearing press, it can be quite difficult to get that press fit working nicely. To get around this, I've found that putting the bearing races, the outer bearing races into the freezer, as well as the spindle for the interior bearing race, allows you to slip it together quite nicely. So I'll go and grab the bearing races. The next step in this build process is to fit the bearing races into the J1 turret housing. And these are the 32009 bearings. They're tapered, and you want the taper to be facing outward, so it gets thinner towards the top and thicker at the base. So where it says 32009, that goes into the bearing, into the J1 turret. And again, because I put them in the freezer, it fits in nicely. Whereas if you don't put them in to the freezer, it's incredibly difficult to get them to fit. And even then, it's still a press fit to hold them into place. So while this is heating up and expanding, we want to make sure that they're pressed right into the J1 turret, like that. We'll also take the inside of the 32009 bearings and fit them onto the J1 spindle. Once again, this is being designed as a press fit, so the J1 spindle also goes into the freezer, making it smaller so that you can fit it into the inside. Here is the J1 spindle. You can see it's quite cold. It's negative 18 degrees at the moment, which has really shrunk this down, meaning we can take a bearing here. We place this upside down like so, sitting with the 4 mounting holes facing downward, and we can put our bearing such that the 32009 faces the floor. And this, given the temperature difference, so long as we slide it on vertically, will just fit down onto the shaft like so. At this point in time, we want to fit it such that the 5 holes are sitting on the top side of the turret. So while this is sitting down, we take the turret like so, with the flat to the top side, and we place it down over this with gravity holding the bearing race at the very bottom. We can then take our other 32009 bearing and fit that over the spindle, and it will fit in perfectly like this. Pressing down so that we make sure that the bottom bearing race is all the way at the top, and we'll put some bearing grease in after the fact through the top here. But it should spin nicely like so. While this goes on, there's a M8 by 10 cap screw, which was located in the same small pouch as the screws for the base here. And this one goes into the J1 platform. So we can now turn this over and locate the J1 platform along all of our mechanical parts. So here we have the J1 platform, and with it facing upwards such that the countersunk parts are located in the top, we can put the M8 by 10 cap screw into the back here. And that will act as the J1 limit switch. So during this time, the super glue has solidified on the back here and dried such that we can put it back down, face down onto the work platform. Next step is to fit the bearing races into the J2 turret housing. So these bearing races are the 206 bearing races, and once again we've put them in the freezer to cool them down, only about half an hour, and that's led to them being able to kind of clip in. Once again, we're putting the number towards the center of the turret housing, and that will be held in place just like that for that to heat up as well. While those heat up, we're going to secure this J2 turret housing to the J1 platform using some M6 by 18 screws. So these flathead screws, once again, the bags aren't labeled, but there's 9 of these screws as per the bill of materials. So we'll take 3 of these black high tensile screws out, and it's a bit in the manual it shows it as being a silver screw, but these are being delivered as black high tensile ones in the kit that I've received from Annan Robotics. So the 3 of these go into the J1 platform like so, sitting flush with the base of it, and they screw in to a couple of holes on the bottom of the J2 turret housing. And the next step after this is to attach these 5 into the 5 screws, 5 holes here in the J1 spindle. So the J1 platform will attach onto the J1 spindle like so, and we use 5 M6 by 14 socket head screws to do so. So we'll find those M6 by 14 screws, and there should be 13 of those, so we're looking for a set of 13 screws against the the top of the J1 spindle. So checking the thread, that's the right thread. Checking the length, we're looking for 14 mil, which is this. And there should be a grand total of 13 of these. However, we need 5 for the top of the J1 spindle. So making sure that we've got enough here. So there's 5 there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 there. So that makes up the 13. So at this point here, we'll bring this a little bit closer to me. It's still quite cold. And it doesn't appear as though there's any particular orientation that is required when installing this to begin with. Just making sure that these are actually lined up. It's a little bit unwieldy given that it's rotating as you're trying to tighten it up, but it's also not holding itself level. And I can see already that I made a mistake earlier in the process, which hopefully we can quickly rectify. I'll place it round such that the 4 holes go where all of these holes are around the outside. There we are. And we can take all of these out and line it up, and we caught that just in time. And there, we can now mount this on there, and we have a rotating J1 turret. So there's J1 turning. And the next step is that there's 4 M4 by 10 set screws that sit in the outside here. So we need to find these to apply tension to the bearing. Not the M4 by 5 set screws, so finding some longer ones. This last one is very annoying because you can't turn the Allen key the whole way around. This looks beautifully seated on the turret housing with the bolt that we installed before for the limit switch extending out correctly. So very minimal gap that sits between the two, and we can adjust that gap by changing these set screws. So as we loosen them out, that gap can close a little bit, and when we tighten them up, we're pushing the bearing away and opening that gap up just a little. So now we're going to turn the base over and use some 4x10 sockets. That bearing race still isn't fully warmed up, and so it's slipping out of the J2 turret housing. It's getting much tighter now. So we'll adjust that, press it in. We've got this in. We now need to turn this on its side and use some of the pan head socket screws, or pan head screws, socket head cap screws to hold the J1 turret housing into the J1 base plate. So carefully watching that these bearing races don't fall out. Turning that round, lined up. It still hasn't fully warmed up to expand in there. And we can turn this turret housing over to be able to tighten it up from the bottom. So I need to turn the turret housing around till the holes line up. And then there'll be some M4x10 socket head cap screws, which we'll use to tighten up the base here. We also need to make sure that the limit switch flat is pointing towards the back, towards the rear. So line all of that up. And these, we're using 8 of these M4x10 socket head cap screws. So just double checking the length of them, which is 10 mil, and also checking the quantities, but we'll go ahead and install these using a 3mm Allen key. So we'll turn it around so you can see there's 8 holes on the base here. We're just going round from the top to hold it in because it wants to fall away. Now, while we have it upside down, we're going to skip forward a couple of pages in the manual to where we're installing the 60-tooth timing pulley onto the J1 spindle. And we'll do this ahead of installing the motor and the belt, which sits underneath here. So there'll be a timing belt that sits underneath, and this will go to the J1 motor that sits in this gap here. So to do this, we need some M6x14 socket head cap screws. So we'll find those. Okay, so with that in, we'll now flip it over and work on mounting the J1 motor at the back here. So we have the J1 motor mount. And we'll just quickly clean this up before we get to installing the motor. Following a bit of a cleanup, we have the base here. Everything's rotating properly, and it's now time to install the J1 motor. The first step of this is making sure that you have the key installed in the shaft of the J1 motor. So there's a 3mm key. In the build manual, it says that it comes in a small Ziploc bag, but as mentioned in episode 2 when we looked at the stepper motor kit, these were actually pre-installed on the shaft underneath these yellow caps. So make sure that you've got that keyway, that key in the keyway, either pre-installed or find it with the stepper motor kit. Now, following the manual, we want to make sure that the wires are to the right of the motor, and the J1 motor mount, which has these two screws at the back, are sitting so that the screws are pointing backward when the wires are coming out to the right hand side. Now, to secure this, we need 4 M4 by 10 flathead screws. These are recessed in, so they're countersunk. And we'll use a 2mm Allen key to fit these in. Again, not using any thread locker at this point in time. We can go back and do that in future. Now, in the AR4 Robotic Arm kit that comes from AR4 Robotics, there is a bag containing all of the different pulleys and a belt, which is not to be confused with this big thick belt with the coarse teeth. So we're going to go look for the one that has a keyway in here. We'll also bring this belt out now. So there's a couple of belts in here. And once again, we're looking for a pulley that has a keyway in it. So this is our pulley here, 15 teeth with an 8mm bore and 2 holes for putting set screws into. And this will fit, slide over our shaft here, over the keyway. Not putting too much force on it. We also need to leave an 11mm gap at the bottom between the base and the flange of the pulley. So that's a bit hard to measure, but I'm just using a ruler to measure 11mm, which means that it's only pressed about halfway onto the keyway, onto the key on here. So push down just a little bit more, and then measuring once again to make sure that this is the correct distance, so 11mm. It's enough for the key to be in there, but you can see that it's not pressed the whole way down. Now we're going to find our small bag of set screws over here, and we need 2 M3 by 4 set screws. So we're really looking for the smallest possible set screws in here, which are these ones here. and using a small Allen key to fit these into the set screws. So we're looking for even smaller than that. These are the tiny M3x4 set screws, which require a 1.5mm Allen key to install. And you can see it going into the pulley there. So we want to make that nice and tight. Find another one of those, making sure we're not losing any other set screws in the process. So these are pretty much the smallest set screws in the kit. Or you can come in over the top of the pulley, just make sure that they're tight. One probably won't go in as much as the other because in the pulley I have, it's sitting over the top of the key. So it's obviously pressing down onto the key and not going as far in as the other set screw that's offset by 90 degrees. We're going to find another 2 set screws. So we're looking for the M3x10 set screws that go into the back of here. So we'll tip a whole lot of set screws out and just find the longer 10mm by 3mm, so quite small diameter compared to the others, and just measure the length, which is 10mm. These go into the motor tension slots, will go into the back of the motor mount, and they're used to tension the motor. Now we have those, we can pack all of our set screws away, making sure we don't lose any. Okay, now we've mounted these, the tensioners go towards the back, and we fit the motor upright like this, with the wires pointing out towards the left-hand side of the enclosure, where the DM332T stepper motor drivers are sitting. So I need to find 4 M4x20 socket head screws. So going through our kit and having a look for those. And there we go. These should do it by hand. So we can get another 3 of those. And just using them to put the J1 motor in place. Make sure that these are reasonably tight. It'll stop the J1 motor from moving around when we turn this over to install the belt. Speaking of the belt, we're looking for the 180 by 180 XL07 belt, which is this one here. Now we've done that, we can turn this all over, find the 180 XL belt, and install the belt underneath. We can see it fits pretty much perfectly. So even though we did those sockets up a little bit, we've still left enough in there for us to be able to slide the motor back and forward on the mount, and we can slide it back and tighten it up a little bit. So while we're holding it in place tight, I'm just tightening these bolts on the other side. With the belt able to move, but with not too much flex in it, and not able to skip the teeth. And then tighten the set screws at the back, which is quite a difficult task because there's not a lot of space in here. So we're only really able to go 90 degrees at a time. And I'm going to use some pliers as suggested in the build manual. So I've done the set screws up, and now this is very stiff to move, and you can feel it actually moving, or having to push against the tension of the belt and turn the motor around. You can feel each step as you slowly move the J1 turret. And that's the physical installation of joint 1. Thanks for watching the video. Like and subscribe, and there'll be a lot more content coming soon.